like to call to order this Urban Renewal Agency work session. In attendance, Council President Gustafson, Councilors Rippey, Martinez, Marshall, Valenzuela, and Councilor Ewing is joining via Zoom. And we have various city staff in attendance. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Economic Development Coordinator Miles Glowacki. No, did I mess that one? Glowacki. That's right, Glowacki. And then Community Development Director Brian Cole. Thank you, gentlemen.
Before we move forward, I still have no picture of the council. I do have picture of the, excuse me, presentation. So since I'm working blind right now, would you guys please identify yourselves when you speak? Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that, Councilor Ewing. It's Paul's fault. Great. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good evening. I'm Miles Glowacki, the Economic Development Coordinator for the city. Tonight we'll begin a series of meetings to discuss how to move the urban renewal plan forward. This presentation will focus on the exciting world of tax increment financing. Slide, please. This is a map of our urban renewal area. The area covers both commercial, residential, and transitional areas. Slide, please. Our urban renewal area uses tax increment financing to fund infrastructure and redevelopment efforts. The goal is to encourage private investment and revitalization of our blighted areas. The TIF is not a new tax or a tax rate increase. Next slide, please. This chart illustrates how the tax increment financing works. We set a baseline. That's that green line at the bottom. And then we collect into a special account, the TIF, anything over that baseline tax. And as the years progress, hopefully that tax rate increases and we bring more. Till the end of the urban renewals area. And then at that point, the full tax goes back to the general fund.
Miles, can I make one addition to that comment? Don't mind. Councilor Ewing, this is Jesse Vander Zanden, City Manager. In looking at this particular graph, one of the reasons that cities do urban renewal agencies and urban renewal districts is that curve that you see that shows the TIF that is being collected that goes up. The thought behind an urban renewal agency is by that reinvestment and by that economic development, that's going to be a steeper curve than otherwise if you did not create the URA. So if you could envision another line that would be at a 3% growth rate, which would tend to be the assessed value growth rate that you see city at large, that would be about probably halfway between the baseline and the top line. So the thought being, when you get done with your urban renewal agency and that money reverts back to the general fund, you have more money coming back to the general fund than if you had not made those investments during the time of the urban renewal agency. Does that make sense? Okay. That's a fundamental principle of these urban renewal agencies, is that line is steeper because of reinvestment, and because it's steeper, you're going to collect more money at the end than if you did not make those investments during the time of the urban renewal agency. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you. This is Miles again. Next slide, please. So the city designated the urban renewal area in May of 2014 after conducting a study that found many parcels and buildings were blighted, meaning they were aging or of poor quality construction, have interior arrangements that are not conducive to business, or parcels that are irregular or too small in size for redevelopment. At the time of designation, the city established the baseline property tax. And Paul's got all the numbers if you're interested. Different numbers were. Slide, please. Now that we have a baseline, we can use the urban redevelopment tools to increase property values. With improved infrastructure, new developments, rehabilitation of aging structures, increase the economic activity in the area, and that allows for an increase in the taxable assessed value. Next slide, please. As property values and assessed value rise, tax revenue increases. This additional tax over the baseline is collected as the TIF. And then the next slide, please. TIF revenue can then be used for funding additional redevelopment efforts, creating a positive feedback loop of increased economic activity. I think it's one of the really important things about a URA district is that once it gets going and gets started, you get a synergy around the redevelopment, and you kind of reach a critical point when it starts to really take off. The Urban Renewal Plan outlines how the revenue can be used. Programs include infrastructure projects, public amenities, redevelopment grants, land banking, and other projects aimed at stimulating economic growth. Slide. As the city makes investments in the area through the TIF, the area's attractiveness for businesses, residents, and visitors increases, inviting private funding and development to further enhance the area. Slide. Then after the area has met its maximum level of indebtedness or reaches its time limit, in the city's case in 2033, the area expires and the TIF revenue reverts back to the city's general fund and to the other districts. Ideally, an area that was once blighted is revitalized, and that revitalization has an echo through the whole community. To Jesse's point, what comes out at the end is often more than what would have happened just under direct market forces. Our presentation on the TIF. When we come back, we want to talk about outcomes to date and then some new projects to consider. Are there any questions?
And would you, this is Mayor Wenzel, could you give the council, I mean, I think this was like just a catch up, like a recap history. So can you give a little bit more context of things to come and just to make sure any questions that they have, we get answered now. Understanding how an urban renewal district works, so we're ready to move on with what's coming next. Just didn't know if the whole council like understood that this is like about getting you caught up. Where we are now.
Sure. So a couple of examples is the Jesse Quinn project, which was recently paid off, the bond on that. So we're in a good position to move forward with some other projects that are outlined in the plan, including looking at land banking, where we find land that could be redeveloped. Maybe it's a couple of parcels. We want to present also in the plan is for some rehabilitation grants, so building rehabilitation and interior improvements, environmental. Decreasing the environmental impact of a building would be eligible.
Go ahead, Jesse.
So, Mayor, members of the council, the only thing I would add is if you could maybe turn back to slide 10, Paul. The Urban Renewal Agency is really kind of swiftly coming upon an inflection point. And Miles mentioned earlier that at a certain point, an urban renewal agency will really kind of start to take off, so to speak. We're fast approaching what that point is. And so the context of this discussion today is to do some kind of re-education about what an urban renewal agency is, what its intent is, what the purpose of it is, how it functions, but also what this inflection point really is as you recall during the budget process, the loan payments that were done as part of the Jesse Quinn project are going to be paid off this year. Those are a little over $300,000. And so from a tax increment perspective, the Urban Renewal Agency is going to be bringing in approximately $650,000 on a per annum basis in tax increment financing once those loans are paid off. That's a fair amount of investment that you can do in the Urban Renewal Agency to accomplish some of these objectives that you see up here. And so what we want to get I keep saying the council, the board, excuse me. What we want to get the board to start thinking about is kind of not only what do we do with our current assets, which is Site B. That's one of the assets that we have. Essentially, we're land banking Site B right now. If you recall, we did go through a process to do an RFP. We did get a proposal under that RFP, but the exclusive negotiating agreement expired. And so that's kind of an open parcel, if you will. We went through several sessions with the board to try and determine kind of what they may want to see on that site, how much financial incentive they may want to provide to achieve that goal that they had for that site. But essentially, we're sitting on Site B, and if you look at the things that the Urban Renewal Agency can do, we really want to get the board to start thinking about infrastructure projects. Festival Street, for example, is one of those. Public amenities. That could be things that you do in certain areas of the urban renewal area. It could be parklets, it could be storefront facades, it could be those kinds of things. As Miles mentioned, the redevelopment grants, land banking, other developments. So they have to be within that urban renewal area. And then the other thing, I guess, if you would go back to slide 4. So the focus here, if you'll see, is trying to increase that taxable assessed value. And so one of the things that we would encourage the board to consider in all of these considerations about how to spend this funding stream is to kind of ask that fundamental question of, will it increase the taxable assessed value for this area? Because when you increase that taxable assessed value, when the Urban Renewal Agency ends in 2035, unless the board extends it, you will return more money to the general fund. So that's the objective, is to try and increase that taxable assessed value throughout that period by making wise investments in things that will increase the value. And in doing so, then it'll have a benefit toward the general fund when it's done. So that was part of this intent of today, was to give the board that kind of overall thing, because we are at an inflection point. And so as this is the first in a series of urban renewal work sessions that we plan on having, Miles and Brian and Paul and myself, to start putting things in front of the board about what do you want to do. And the reason we're kind of doing that now is not just because of the funding stream, but also there are continually, properties that may come up. And instead of being in a reactive mode, we'd like to try and see if we could be in a proactive mode when it comes to considering these types of things. So we're kind of we're not quite there yet. The loan's not paid off yet, but when it is, there's going to be a funding stream there that wasn't there before. So I hope that answers your question, Mayor, members of the board. Thanks.
I'm going to go with, did you have something? I'm going to go with Councilor Ewing first. Go ahead, Councilor Ewing.
So, Jesse, the horizon on it at this point in time is 2035.
That's correct. That's when the Urban Renewal Agency expires.
And so the next time we do this presentation, could you guys put together, please, some examples from other communities who have a URA and who have used them? It's wonderful to list those for us, Jesse, but I think visually it's more impactful if we can see how some of the projects have been handled in other communities as well. Thank you.
Sure. I guess one thing to maybe, and it's not a picture of it, Councilor Ewing, but some municipalities under the Urban Renewal Agency will kind of make a specific approach, if you will. I'll give you one example, the city of Sherwood. Their approach has been to essentially land bank. And when they land bank, they own, I don't know how many parcels they own now, but the last time I checked, they own, I think, 5 or 6 parcels. And they have kind of intentionally purchased those properties, and then they intentionally engage in processes to either sell them or provide incentives to develop, or in some cases, they develop themselves. So there's kind of a myriad of examples out there about what to potentially do. Portland Development Commission is another example. Portland Development Commission is structured differently, but it's still tax increment financing. It's just with the city of Portland, it's managed a little bit differently. A lot of larger municipalities do it that way, but they've taken a pretty aggressive redevelopment approach. This Pearl District is a good example. So those are just a few, but thank you for the feedback, Councilor Ewing, and yeah, we can certainly try and kind of provide some additional examples about how URAs work and what their intent and purpose is. So thank you for the question.
Brian, did you want to say?
It's a little bit dated of a comment now, but I'm just going to say that, one of the things that's important in this presentation is the fact that we do have an urban renewal plan. In 2014, when the urban renewal district was formed, it was formed to implement a plan. Website, I believe you probably all have copies of it. If not, I'm happy to get you. And that plan is one of the sort of key pieces of recognizing, again, this is about urban renewal. We have a lot of historic buildings in Forest Grove. Anybody who's ever owned a business or done construction downtown knows that it's not always cheap to renovate an old historic building, to get those up to codes and things like that. So one of the things we're going to be talking about very soon is interior and exterior building renovation program to have grants of a certain dollar amount to do those. It's founded on the premise that it's harder and more expensive to develop and to reuse these buildings. And the market doesn't work as easily in areas as it does in greenfield development, if you will. And so that's kind of the spirit with which our plan was created. What we're talking about coming up is as the next steps in implementing our plan. It's not just sort of ideas that staff is having.
Any other questions for staff? Okay, Jesse has another.
Sorry.
It's fine.
Since we have time in the entrance of conveying additional information, so when I mentioned an inflection point earlier with regard to the funding, another way to maybe kind of look at this is right now the kind of one asset that the URA has is Site B. Okay, that's the land asset, the lot that we have that the URA has in downtown. Other than that, the URA has funded kind of continually, and again, I want to kind of mention that we're going to have, approximately $650,000 coming in revenues after the loan is paid off. The ongoing programs that the URA has had on a per annum basis have been in the neighborhood of, approximately $50,000-$60,000 a year that are kind of ongoing programs. The storefront facade program is an ongoing program. That's a grant program for improving the facade of your business. There was a public art installation program that was $20,000 a year for 4 years. There was a parklet program that was done under the Urban Renewal Agency. Not a lot was expended on that. And so you're almost, it's not quite a blank slate that you're dealing with, but it's pretty close in terms of looking at the use of those monies from a future basis. And so it's just, the only reason I kind of mentioned that is for the next couple work sessions that we have queued up, there really is going to be some kind of strategic thinking about where you want to go with this. Where does the board want to go with the Urban Renewal Agency? Where do you want to look at, putting some of your funding? What type of projects might you want to do? And it could be a host of alternatives. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So if you go back to slide 10, Paul, it could be a combination of all those things. It doesn't have to be just one particular thing. So kind of maybe if you get a chance to think about it, it really is kind of this interesting point in history with the URA, and we're hopeful that we can have some good productive discussions with the board and see where you want to go.
Councilor Rippey.
Thank you. But while we're on this slide, I think one of the things that would be of interest to me is developing some way, trying to develop, I'm sorry, Councilor Ewing, it's Councilor Rippey or Director Rippey speaking. Not that you can't recognize my voice, but anyway, with regard to these different bullets, and there might be others as well, but what's the return on investment? In other words, is land banking a better return on investment than public amenity or a infrastructure project that just adds a facade to a building? Rather, we understand what the return on investments all are by these different mechanisms so that can help inform us as to what the priorities ought to be. Because if you go back to that graph, if you don't do that yellow line, you don't get to the red thing.
Well, and that return on investment is measured in, does it increase the taxable assessed value, right? And that's where that measurement juxtaposes itself. is in that. So,
And
yeah.
so is there one type of investment? In other words, I can conceivably say, well, for example, let's buy the parking lot from Wells Fargo. Well, that may not be a very good investment, although we could use downtown parking. It may not be the best investment for this money. As opposed to, there's a vacant lot down on 19th Street that we want to land bank. So that's what I guess my question's about. Thanks.
I think if I can just butt in for a second. Sorry, Councilor Ewing, Brian Paul. Miles used the term positive feedback loop, but I really like that term because as you do more investments that bring in more money, that line gets steeper and steeper going up. And it is kind of a snowball effect how this can work. And you're spot on with that, though.
So just add one last thing. At the Oregon City Managers Conference, there was a Pendleton Urban Renewal Agency tour. Pendleton has had an urban renewal agency in place for a long time. And the principal thing that they're doing with their URA monies is they had a lot of blight in downtown. So there was a lot of vacant buildings. There was a lot of vacant storefronts. It was having a detrimental impact on commerce in downtown. And so they took their urban renewal funds and they targeted trying to do internal and external renovation of the buildings, not necessarily facades per se, that could be part of it, but it was the actual building itself, kind of making sure it stays up, making sure it's structurally sound, and then trying to get businesses to come back into that. And so they even did a program where they would try to incentivize businesses coming into those redeveloped buildings, and it would look like a partnership. It would be a partnership where they may have a private owner of the building, but there was a grant program that would allow for redevelopment of that structure. And what they've found is that a lot of those kind of old and decaying buildings that would otherwise be a blight in the downtown have been improved. And because of that improvement, as Miles kind of mentioned, it's really caught on, and that creates additional investment in downtown. And so if you go in downtown Pendleton today, it arguably looks a lot different than it would have if they had not made those kind of strategic investments. So it was less land banking, and it was more in their particular case, doing redevelopment projects of existing buildings within or public-private partnerships through a grant program or something like that. So anyways, these are all potential options under the URA guided by the plan, all of which what we've talked about here are within the plan. So.
Any additional questions? Okay, with that, I'm going to adjourn this work session. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. Have a nice night. And we're going to,